philosophy of the middle class, and we observe that there is in the way he discusses everything, there is a sort of replacement of philosophy by science. So that is there, and also there is, as we discussed yesterday, there is this convergence of philosophy and science, which is sort of a contradicting point, but uh, this was discussed, and then we discussed the difference between Plato's ideology and Kant's ideology. And uh, so Plato said, as we have also done previously, Plato said that the pen that we hold, we used the example of a pen yesterday, and he suggests that the pen that we hold is not real, but the idea of the pen that we have in our minds, that is real.
Correct.
This was known as ontological dualism. Plato's theory was dualistic in nature because of dual nature. Well, and in opposition to this, what Kant said was that the pen is real, and the idea of the pen out of the pen does not exist. Uh, and this was known as ontological.
No, I think there is slight correction, Jaldi. The idea
Yes,
of the pen and the pen both are the same.
yes,
Or, right,
yeah, yes, yes. I'm sorry, I meant that, but sorry.
right.
Yes, the idea of the pen and the pen are the same thing, which
Hmm.
is pointing to to only one thing, for because of which
Hmm.
the Kant's ideology was known as ontological monoism.
Right.
Right?
And
And
that pen
what?
has an objective existence, right?
Yes,
Uh,
it is very.
it does not have an objective real existence. The objective existence is a kind of inferior or derivative or imperfect version of the idea in the mind.
Yes.
Right.
And furthermore, he goes on to say that uh, one can know the pen only up to the extent that that the individual's faculty of reasoning allows them to know the pen.
Hmm.
So
Correct.
the the pen exists even out of their faculty of reasoning, but one cannot know that it's unknowable. So this, so up to the
Pen,
extent to,
pen is in itself is not knowable.
yes,
Right.
pen in itself, yes, that was the word used. And yeah, so the extent up to which we know the pen is known as the phenomena, and the extent up to which we cannot, the unknowable part of the pen in itself, as Sir rightly pointed out, is known as the noumena.
Correct.
And we discussed Hegel's statement about this,
Hmm.
and Hegel stated that what is rational is real, and what is real is rational. So
Hmm.
that was said in critique and in response to Kant. And then we discussed what we today know as the cognitive process. Um, so there is this idea of sensibility, uh, and sensibility is I mean, it is the faculty that allows sensory data. I mean, that collects sensory data from ears, nose, eyes, whatever.
Right.
And this data is then sent to the mind, and concepts exist in the mind, and there is imagination in the mind. And with the help of this concept and imagination, the data is transformed in form with the help of association. So that's, I think, where we stopped today.
Right.
Stopped yesterday. Um, and that's all
We
I
did
remember.
mention one more point, if you remember, precisely where we have left off. Where you left off.
I seem to not recall it. I'm sorry. I just
Anyone else? No, but you have summarized it well. Uh, Good. So, who else remembers something else apart from the points that Jaldi covered? Yeah, Mansi. Hmm. Right. Human will and God existing in nominal domain as noumena. You are right. Correct. Anything else? Yes. Anyone else remember something else? Right. Correct. So, the shared ground between human mind and nature is purposiveness, and that is transcendental. Right. Correct. I think Jaldi did mention it, but yeah, it's called purposiveness. Anything else? Does anyone remember anything else? The beautiful, right? Right, Titiksha did, she did mention understanding, imagination, and sensibility, but Mansi talks about experience of beautiful and how that is, right? Okay, so let's look at the same point that Mansi is talking about in a greater detail. Uh, so I will share the screen now.
So I would want you to elaborate a little bit about
Hmm.
the human will that
Oh,
Mansi pointed.
okay,
I mean,
okay, yeah, go ahead.
no, so I would ask you to elaborate because I kind of missed out on that yesterday.
No,
Uh,
human will and God, immortality of soul, and all those ideas, according to Kant, are in the domain of noumena because they are thinkable rather than sensible, intelligible, right? We can think of these things, but we cannot experience these things. Uh,
Also, human will?
will, yeah.
How? I mean,
How do you experience will? Means you when you eat, say for example, right, then you are not aware of the action that you're doing, for instance, right, or where it comes from, the source of will or volition. Its source is undisclosed of action, according to the German idealism, and
oh,
something which later on Schopenhauer elaborates upon, and he builds entire edifice like Kant on based on the idea of will, right? But we are not going into that for a moment. We are interested in the questions of art and beauty as elaborated by Kant, and yes, the emotional response rather than conceptual response, right, is what we were discussing yesterday. So let's just look at it more systematically once again as we proceed. So look at this slide. Can you see this? Not slide, but my uh,
yes, sir, we
notes here.
can.
Yeah. So what you
Yes, we
can
can.
see here is how transcendental idealism is. For example, how does it work? Is what we are talking about here. And uh, according to Kant, how do we know something like the pen? For example, the object pen is, according to Kant, knowable because our senses give us sensory data and imagination transforms it into uh, forms. It gives it forms, and imagination gives this form to understanding. Now, what does understanding do? Understanding provides concepts, right? And how does it provide concept? According to Kant, it is because understanding is supplied concepts by something called transcendental analytic. Transcendental analytic is faculty of reason which provides categories like time, space, like causality, like uh, all the categories that we associate, like dimensions, like weight, like the basic categories of understanding, right? Imagination converts it into form. Sensibility is governed by something called transcendental analytic by Kant. Why it is transcendental? Because it transcends individuals, right? Individual faculty of knowing. It is above, it is something that is a priori to both nature and the knower, right? This. It is both transcendental to both. That's why it's called transcendental aesthetic and transcendental analytic. Aesthetic, it means here sensory data. It has something to do with senses. So what does it provide? According to Kant, it provides intuitions of space, time, and other things. Very interestingly, Kant believes that space and time are not products existing independently of reason or human faculty of knowing. Space and time, the cognition of space and time is not dependent, according to Kant, on their objective existence, but they seem to get objective existence because of faculty of reasoning. What he is basically saying that there is no such thing as space and time independent of uh, human knower. Now that is a slightly difficult idea to understand. For example, how does space exist is brought into by into the world by human beings, right? That is a difficult idea to understand. What it means here is that you have to assume space a priori. That means, say for example, you say that the screen that you are holding in your hand or in front of you has space, occupies space. Now you may say, how is this space given by my mind or cognition or cognitive process or faculty of knowing? How is it possible? Then Kant argues that to understand space, you have to understand that this objective, the object in front of you, maybe this pen or this screen, which exists in space, uh, exists separately from you, independently from you, right? So it is different from you. Now, once it is different from you and uh, the object is at some space from you, there is space between you and the object already, right? To say that this is an object having occupying space, you have already assumed a space between you and the object. So that has to be a priori assumed, which is slightly strange for us. So what he says that we apprehend object through our sensible intuition, that is sensibility, which is governed by transcendental aesthetic, right? And it is given form by imagination, power of imagination, by giving it order in space and time. Imagination reproduces it into mental image and understanding recognize it by placing it under a general category. So what do you mean by general category is this is a phone. How do you know this is phone? Because this is the particular phone that you identify on basis of the category called phone, which is the general category. So it fits into that. And this act of recognition or placing individual object into general category is something what he calls as judgment, right? So look at this. What do you mean by judgment? According to Kant, judgment means faculty of subsuming particular under the universal, right? And let us go back to something called syllogism that you found that we discussed in Aristotle. And this syllogism, this is called axiom, right? This is called middle term. And this is called the conclusion that you derive, right? So all men are mortal. Now this statement is a priori, right? You don't have to meet everybody to find out that a person is mortal. Socrates is a man. Now you don't know whether Socrates is a man or a cat. You have to verify it. So it is a priori, a posteriori. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That is how we think in syllogistic terms, right? This is something we discussed in Aristotle. And what Kant is trying to say is that knowledge must be obtained from both a priori and a posteriori components of knowing. And this is what Jaldi mentioned when she says that she Kant reconciles rationalism and empiricism, because rationalism says that knowledge should be a priori only, and empiricism says knowledge should be a posteriori. What Kant is saying that it is both a priori and a posteriori. And to have this kind of knowing, there should be harmony, agreement, and correlation between these components. And this is transcendental. I am just revising what we have already discussed. And this kind of judgment, fitting Socrates, right, into the concept or category called man, right, is called determinative kind of judgment. Right? So what kind of judgment is this? That all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Sir,
This kind of question.
isn't this an example of syllogism?
Yes, but syllogism as a faculty of what happens is syllogistic thinking is logical thinking.
Yes.
And that is how judgments are formed, right? This is
Yes.
generally how you make judgments. This happens very fast, right?
Yes.
This
Yes.
is given by understanding. This is given by sensibility, right? This
Right.
men and mortal are the categories. All
Yes.
men are mortal are categories, right? Given by transcendental analytic. Socrates is an individual person, right? And he also is man. And therefore, Socrates is mortal is a conclusion that you have drawn when you fit Socrates under man and mortal, and therefore under mortal. This is a general statement. This is a particular individual statement, and this is the conclusion that is drawn from it. Right? Is that much clear? This is a general statement. This is individual example. You can change the name Socrates, make it like, say, for example, if you want to make John, right? He's a man. Now, John can be a cat or a dog as well. So you have to find out whether it is really that John is man, right? And
So
therefore,
would you?
yeah.
I'm sorry for
Yeah.
interrupting.
No, no, please do.
I didn't. Would you please repeat what we discussed earlier, like right before this?
This is what we discussed, right? How do we know something is understanding, imagination, and sensibility are the faculties of human mind. And they are governed by these two transcendental faculties. Understanding is given concepts by transcendental analytic, and sensibility, that is the faculty of knowing things from the senses, is governed by transcendental aesthetic, right? Which supplies intuitions of space and time as well, right? And imagination is the faculty which transforms this sensory data into form, and this is has a concept. So Socrates, right, is a man. You have these categories here of man, mortal, are, being, and so on, exist in understanding of human beings governed by transcendental analytic. So when you see John, right, and you know that all men are mortal, you decide whether John is man or John is name of a computer, right, using your sensory organs. It is a posteriori that you know that John is a man. And then it is converted by imagination into some form, and this form coincides with a concept called man and mortal, and you know that this object John is mortal. This is what happens in a split of a second, microsecond. This is how you recognize this is a pen and this is John. But what he's talking about, that this act of drawing conclusions like this, therefore Socrates is mortal, is what we mean by judgment. So I am defining what Kant is trying to say by judgment, right? Is that clear? So the judgment in which uh, specific is subsumed under general is called determinative judgment, right? That is the
What?
category, that's the term he uses. Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's bad timing. Uh, what would we mean by space and time? Intuition of space and time.
Is perception of space and time. Uh,
Okay.
this
So
bottle
what
occupies space, for example, right? It occupies space, yes, no, it doesn't.
it does, it does.
Now, you may think that it's property of the object, right, to
Mhm.
occupy space. What Kant is saying, that space is to be assumed a priori.
That it will occupy space. Like,
When you say this bottle, it is different from me. So there is some distance between that bottle and me, right? Otherwise, it
mhm.
won't be different. So you require space between this bottle and me. So space is something that you have to assume before you know this is bottle. You have to
Okay.
take it a priori beforehand. स्पेस जैसी कोई चीज है, ये आपको
Okay.
पहले ही मान देना पड़ेगा, बाद में आप कह सकोगे ये बॉटल है और बॉटल ऑक्यूपाई स्पेस.
And sir, how is it related to time?
Time, he gives some complex examples which I'm not going into actually, because it's not directly relevant right now, because
Okay, okay,
we
okay.
want to focus our most of our time on his idea of beauty and art,
Okay, okay.
right? But he
Thank you,
says
sir.
that time is also something to be assumed beforehand, right?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm
And he
sorry for
gives,
interrupting
and
again.
no, no, he gives a series of arguments to justify, not just one. I am giving you one example of how space is to be assumed, right? So it's an elaborate argumentation that he has built up in his books. which we can't go into for the lack of time, and that is not also our primary focus, right? Our primary focus is how it's related to literature and art, basically. But I am discussing only those aspects of Kant which are relevant to his study of uh, literature and art, right? For example, Aristotle would have written a lot about biology, but we couldn't be discussing all those things because our focus is on art and what he says about tragedy. So we discuss only those aspects of Aristotle or Plotinus which are relevant for us to understand their aesthetic theories and ideas of art and literature, right? That's the
Right.
logic.
So before we move further, just one more question.
Go
So
ahead.
there are two categories: transcendental analytic, and there is transcendental aestheticism. So
Yeah.
aesthetic, okay. So imagination and sensibility belong to transcendental aesthetic, and the faculty.
Imagination does not belong to transcendental aesthetic. Imagination
Okay.
is a faculty of human mind.
Yeah, human mind. Yes. So what
It does
belongs to
not have any transcendental laws except for genius. And that's his idea that genius can derive laws of nature through imagination.
Okay.
How does it do it?
So
Only
Newton
genius
would be a
knows
genius.
because it's a genius, right?
Okay.
Okay. If you and I knew, then we would be geniuses too. And
Clearly not. But
right. So, but genius is one of the most important ideas in romantic aesthetics, right? Romantic
okay.
literature. And imagination is also one of very important ideas. So, imagination is faculty of cognitive process, which is there in all human beings. So, imagination is not something that is only quality which genius has, right? Genius has ability to use imagination to draw upon laws of nature, right?
Right.
This imagination is what everybody has. And later on, Coleridge would use the word primary imagination to describe this because Coleridge was deeply influenced by Kant. He was a Kantian scholar, right? So that
Mm,
also tells us why we are discussing Kant at such length because we have to understand Coleridge's theory of imagination as well,
right.
right? So, but my question is, did you get what we mean by determinate judgment and what is judgment?
Yes. The idea that we get from a priori and a
Hmm.
posteriori statements, right?
Right, right.
Okay.
And
Good.
judgment means conclusions that we draw like this,
Yes. Yes.
right? From
Yes.
using
Thank
syllogism.
you,
It
sir.
uses both a priori and a posteriori. Okay. Okay, so let's
Yes.
go back to this thing, transcendental idealism. And one point that we discussed yesterday was that how do I know that this painting, for example, is beautiful, right? What happens that painting uh, sensibility tells me, gives me sensory data about the painting that I'm saying. Imagination converts it, gives it a form, right? But there is no concept of beauty according to Kant. So, in order to make statements like this painting is beautiful, you cannot have a determinate judgment because there is no concept called beautiful. Beautiful is not a concept, right? It describes experience largely, right? And there is an emotional experience called beautiful, which we are able to respond to the painting. Am I being clear here? I see this painting or sunset, a point that somebody mentioned in chat uh, here about Mansi said that, right? Beautiful sunset example. And then Titiksha said that emotional rather than conceptual response. So you remember this, right? So what happens is that human being responds to painting emotionally rather than conceptually, right? That is what Kant says. There is no concept called beautiful, because then it would be very subjective. So this experience of beautiful is subjective, but everybody is capable of that. So for Kant, it is subjective and universal. That is what we discussed yesterday, if you remember. Does anyone remember?
The idea of trivial and particular, sir,
No,
universal
I'm
and
saying that beautiful
yes,
is an emotional response to a work of art, natural
right,
beauty, for example. So it is
right.
subjective and at the same time it is universal. So Jaldi is asking me, subjective ideas cannot be a concept. There is no concept, they have to be invented according to Kant. You have to invent a concept. And how do we go about doing it is what we are going to discuss. And according to Kant, and Kant, for example, look at this. We cannot have uh, uh, syllogism like this. Can you see this in front of you? This is a beautiful landscape, right? And all landscapes are beautiful. This is a landscape, therefore this is beautiful. ऐसे तो नहीं हो सकता, because all landscapes are not beautiful. Correct?
Right, sir. Right.
All landscape cannot be beautiful. तो ये syllogism है. तो ये जो, if in order to draw this conclusion, this is beautiful, we have to have a different kind of judgment, right? From this kind of judgment. Determinate judgment नहीं हो सकता. Socrates is mortal is a determinative judgment because it subsumes uh, Socrates under man and therefore he is mortal, right? There are concepts, man and mortal. And Socrates is an individual, particular case which can be subsumed under a general category. So it's a different kind of judgment. This is a beautiful landscape is not the same as Socrates is mortal. Is that much clear? These two
Yes,
different,
sir.
Socrates is mortal and this is a beautiful landscape, are different kind of judgments. And that is the argument in his third book called Critique of Judgment. Now, what does he mean by that? He says that there are many judgments, right, which are not of conceptual kind or determinative kind, like this. And that is the limitation of human judgment, rational judgment. Judgment is faculty of understanding. It's something that complements understanding. And there is a limit. And what kind of judgment are, according to Kant, of non-determinative kind? Then look at these judgments now. Doing drugs is wrong, or smoking is wrong, or drinking is wrong. I am doing drugs, therefore what I am doing is wrong. ऐसे conclusions नहीं निकाल सकते हम. Why? Because suppose you are ill, right, or you have to be operated upon, then you will require to be drugged, right? Killing people is wrong. Now, if you are a soldier, then you may need to kill person, right? Yes, no. Ethical judgments cannot be of determinative kind. Morality, according to Kant, cannot be similar to scientific or rational derivations. What Kant is trying to do in his very famous book called Critique of Practical Reason is come up with a rational theory of ethics, that what should you do. Copying in an online examination is wrong, right? What I am doing is copying in online examination and therefore I am wrong. Now this kind of ethical judgments cannot be determinative kind, because there are no absolute universal laws of ethics according to Kant, right? There are no categories of absolute rules in your life. Drive on right side, right? But if you go to different country, you may have to drive on other side, right? So ethical judgment according to Kant and aesthetic judgment. And interestingly, what has happened is that for Kant, aesthetic and ethical has occupied most of his discussion in the third critique. Now, he did not want to be a literary critic. Kant did not set out to write a book on aesthetics. Kant wanted to write about judgment in general. What is possible using judgment? What is the scope of judgment, and what are the limitations of judgment? That's the critique of judgment, right? Now, he has entered into a territory called aesthetics. He did not want to go into that because he was pointing out that you cannot derive laws of aesthetics and laws of ethics from some universal principles. You cannot do that, right? So, such kind of judgments which are not determinative, he uses the word reflexive. These are the reflexive kinds of judgments, right? As against determinative. Now, reflexive judgments, right, involve inventing a universal category, right? And in terms of ethics, for ethics, he uses the term called categorical imperative. What do we mean by categorical imperative? Categories, as you know, are those universal categories supplied by transcendental analytic. But in absence of those categories, you have to invent new categories. And imperative is what we mean by rules, right? And instead of relying upon authorities like religion, state, or elders, you have to derive ethical categories through reasoning. And that you can do by positing something as a universal rule. What do you mean by categorical imperative? According to Kant, say for example, smoking is, or doing drugs, or being an alcoholic is wrong. Now, you may say this is what is written in religious books, or this is what the government says, or this is what the elders tell you. Now, will you accept just because your elders have told you? Will you accept that just because religion has told you, or just because your parents have told you not to be an alcoholic, right? Now, that cannot be the way to derive an ethical principle based on authority. You have to derive ethical principle based on laws of rationality. And according to Kant, and that's a controversial thing, that the ethical law that you can derive using reason is called categorical imperative. You have to use this idea of categorical imperative to derive ethical laws. So, say for example, drinking alcohol is good. If you want to make that kind of, or smoking is good, then you have to make it into a universal principle. That means it is okay if your parents smoke or drink, if your siblings can smoke or do drugs, if your children, if your friends are allowed to do the same. If you say that everyone is entitled to drugs, including your children, siblings, younger brothers, sisters, friends, if you can derive such universal conclusions, then you can say that doing drugs is fine or drinking is fine. Am I making some sense? If you can make those kind of claims, right, that doing drugs is okay, and you can admit that your parents, your children, your partners have freedom to do drugs or smoke, then it is okay for me to do that as well. If you can say that, then such laws are the laws derived by categorical imperative. Anything you have to say about categorical imperative? Any questions? Okay. So aesthetic judgments are also to be derived using laws of rationality, rather than saying that this film is beautiful because my elders like it, or my peers like it, or because a well-known critic says this is a beautiful film. That would be counter rational, that would be irrational, right? That would be pre-enlightenment, right? So you have to derive laws of beauty as well. So in order to make a claim that this is a beautiful landscape, you have to assume, according to Kant, four important principles, right? You have to ensure that this statement, this is a beautiful landscape, is disinterested. That means it is beautiful not because I like it. It is not of my particular liking that it is beautiful. So there is a difference between disinterested claim and the claim that it is beautiful. It's not preference, right? When I say that this is a beautiful painting, it should not be my preference that मुझे तो landscape अच्छे लगते हैं, मुझे laws of rationality are those given by the transcendental faculty, jaldi, of reason, right? Those laws which are laws of transcendental faculty of knowing. Okay. So first assumption you have to make is that my claim that this is beautiful is not my personal preference. I like samosa does not mean that samosa is aesthetically beautiful. My preference is reflects my own interests. So it has to be disinterested. It is not reflection of your particular interest, right? Disinterested is not bored. क्लास में अभी कोई लोग आज जो सुन रहे हैं वो बोर हो गए होंगे, they have lost their interest. Not in that sense. Disinterested in the sense of not having a personal agenda, right? So in order to make a claim this is a beautiful landscape, you should be disinterested. It is universal, right? Because it arises from something which he calls common sense. Now, common sense is not what we mean by common sense today. Common sense means jo senses, our eyes, ears, taste, touch, which is common to all human beings. That is what he means by common sense. All commonality of senses. सबके पास हर ऐसे कॉमन सेंस होना चाहिए, कॉमन सेंस इन दैट सेंस, नॉट कॉमन सेंस एज what we lack, right? Common sense is what we have. That is a different technical term here. It's a universal, it's subjective universal, as I say. Right? It is necessary, it is not trivial in the sense that it should add to the knowledge of your painting or the film or the poem that you're talking about. Right? That is what he means. And fourth, it has purposiveness without purpose. And that's one of the definition of beauty that Kant has said, that it means that it has a common ground, right? We have to assume that nature has purpose, even if it may have none. And this assumption, we have to assume nature has teleology or the ultimate purpose, right? So it has to be derived from this transcendental faculty. So if it fulfills these claims, these four important assumptions, then you can make such a statement: this is a beautiful landscape, right? Just like you derive categorical imperative through this principle. Is that clear? Any questions about this? So far with me, any doubts? Please clarify it.
Yes, sir. One.
Please go ahead.
Sir, would you please repeat what would you mean by categorical imperative? This is very clear. The disinterested, common sense, etc. That is clear. But this part
means universal, imperative means rule, right? So if you can make a particular ethical rule as universal, right? If I ask myself, is doing drugs okay, and doing drugs is okay, can be made into a universal rule. यानी आप सब हर एक आदमी ये ले सकता है ड्रग्स, marijuana, LSD or whatever new drugs you have. If you say that everybody is entitled or has a right to do drugs in the world, if you say that, then only then you can say that doing drugs is okay. Otherwise, it is not.
So, sir, I mean, there are so many exceptions. Then it would not. I mean, then there will be no law, right? Then there will be no rule as such. Because
like, say something more. Yeah.
As in, there are so many exceptions. Like we just discussed the example of drugs, but a person on medications would be actually doing drugs. And in fact, in older times,
I am
cocaine.
asking another question: is doing drugs right or okay? If you want to make that into a universe, if you want to make doing drugs ethically acceptable, then you have to ask yourself, can you make it into categorical imperative, right? Can you make it into universal rule? दुनिया में हर एक के लिए
But isn't it subject to will then? I mean,
yes, it involves use of will, but this will has to be universal, right? So
but then if we make the will necessary, imperative, it is not going to be will anymore. I mean,
no, but no. In order to make ethical principle universe, if it has to be ethical principle at all, right? Like doing drugs is wrong can be an ethical principle, but it can be countered in specific instances, so it cannot be made into a universal rule. Killing people is wrong. Now you can't make it into a universal rule because soldiers have to kill when they're attacked by enemies, right? So it cannot be made into a universal rule. So it's not a categorical imperative. So it's not an ethical.
basically.
Yeah,
Any
go.
statement without any exceptions.
Huh. If you make it into a universal rule, then it can be accepted as ethical principle. So he is telling you what you should do in order to derive ethical principles from reasoning rather than from authority,
All
right?
right, sir, got it.
So only authority acceptable for Kant for ethics is reasoning, and that is the cornerstone of enlightenment. Remember,
Right, right, yes, yes.
if you say that this is wrong because it is said in Quran or Gita or Bible, then it is not enlightenment. It is immaturity, according to Kant. If you derive
Yes,
it from reason, then it is ethical in the modern sense of ethics. So he's talking about how modern ethics can be constructed, right? And
right,
this is a controversial
right.
idea, and then subsequent critics have attacked him on these several points, especially
Right,
Hegel, right?
absolutely.
Uh,
Yes.
but you have to get what Kant is saying, that you can derive laws of ethics from reasoning, right? And that reasoning is when it follows the rule of categorical imperative,
Right.
right?
Thank you. Yes.
Right. Similarly, aesthetics. That is what connects aesthetics with ethics. That you cannot have universal principles, right? There are no categories of universal beauty. In such a situation, to make a statement like it is beautiful, it has to have four conditions which are to be fulfilled. And those four conditions are that it has to be uh, disinterested, it has to be universal based on common sense. The third is that it should be purposiveness, right? It should be purposive, it should follow the rule of purposiveness without purpose. If it has purpose, then it is something else. And that it is necessary. It is not tautological. It is not like saying beautiful painting is beautiful. Then that would be tautological. That is what we mean by necessary. So if it fulfills these four criteria, then you can make a statement, this is a beautiful landscape. Now, people argued that if somebody says this is not beautiful, while someone says this is beautiful, Kant would say that they are disagreeing, right? They are not denying the fact that you can make universal claims. This is a beautiful painting, or this is a beautiful film. You can make such claims, right? It's not that you cannot make such claims. You may disagree. Your friend may say this is bakwas film, and you may say this is excellent film, right? But the fact that you can make a claim this is a beautiful film has to fulfill these four criteria, right? Only then you can uh, substantiate the statement this is beautiful. What is the question? Does categorical imperative be ethically accepted? Acceptability has to be very good question, Jelta. If a particular ethical principle is derived from reason, right? Then according to Kant, it has to be ethically accepted by everybody. Because ethics have to be derived rationally, right? It has to be accepted rationally, not on the basis of a religious authority or state laws or elders or peers or something else, books, whatever, right? So you don't accept any other authority except reasoning. That is what Kant is trying to do. And probably for the first time that you find that rationality is the basis of ethics rather than religion or gurus or religious priests or elders or laws of government. For first time, ethics are based on rationality. So you can see that he is one of the first, most important, uh, earliest, most important philosophers of ethics, modern ethics. Before that, ethics were grounded in religious authorities. Right? ऐसा करना चाहिए, क्यों नहीं करना चाहिए, was based on either religious authorities or political authorities or elders or peers. For first time, he is trying to base ethics on reasoning, and he is extending the same project to aesthetics. Can we derive laws of aesthetics from rationality? That is what he is trying to do. Now he may have failed, right? But the attempt itself is significant. What is its significance? For the first time, ethics, aesthetics, and knowledge has to be grounded in rationality alone rather than on authorities. Right? So you can see how Kant's project is modern project. No, he fails in many ways. For example, you there will always be problem making this statement that this is beautiful, right? Because somebody may disagree. For example, Smith, or uh, ethics. Not all ethical principles can be derived through categorical imperative. And later German philosophers like Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche would very aggressively attack these ideas, though they are in some way continuing Kant's project. He is still being attacked. Hegel would say that Kant fails to ground rationality in history, and therefore laws of ethics, laws of aesthetics, and science always have a historical basis. And according to Hegel, laws of rationality and laws of reasoning are common. We'll see how that is when we discuss Hegel. So even if Kant fails, his project is fairly ambitious, right? And its significance lies in its attempt to create ethics, aesthetics, and science based on rationality, philosophy based on rationality. At the same time, it's also a self-reflexive project, which is also a characteristic of modernity. He is using rationality to understand what rationality can do and cannot do. He is using rationality to discuss ethics. He is using rationality to discuss aesthetics. Right? So you can see how reflexive project is a characteristic feature of modernity. And it is self-consciously modern project of aesthetics, ethics, and philosophy. Any questions?
No, sir, it seems not.
Right. So
Not from
now
my
what I
side.
suggest, now what I suggest is now you listen to these 3 videos, watch them again, right? And if whatever doubts you have about whatever we have discussed, we can bring that up in the next class on Monday, right? And we'll continue some important points about Kant. We have to examine his ideas of sublime and idea of free beauty and idea of genius that we just touched upon, right? And how Kant argues that aesthetics is a autonomous domain, all these are key ideas that we will be discussing next week, right? These are the very important ideas. Okay, right? So we stop here for today in case you don't have questions. If you have questions, we'll resolve them right now if something comes up in your mind.
Sir, yes, I had one question. Why is the title of the book a critique of pure reason? What do you mean by pure reason? And there is also practical reason. So
Practical reason is the reason that is involved in ethical decisions. What can I know? What should I do? Right? What should I do? Then how do I know what should I do? You have to base it on rationality. The will has to be yoked to rationality. So that is critique of practical reason. If you pure reason is what are the limitations of pure reason or determinative judgment? What are the limitations of that? And what is the scope of that? That's what he means by pure reason. You can see how pure reason is reason which is unfettered from the religious and authoritative discourses. It's a concept of ideal reason, right? Which itself is a deeply modern idea. That reason can be pure, not contaminated by religion or legality or uh, community norms, right? So pure reason in
yes,
that sense.
sir.
Not in Plato, you don't have pure reason, or in Plotinus or in others, because reason is seen as subsidiary of faith. So you can see that there is a distinctive turn towards atheism as well. Though he is trying to conserve the idea of God, there is a kind of putting rationality at its heart of morality, which is a radical and revolutionary attempt. Morality as rational rather than derived from reason is a revolutionary idea, right? Okay, so we will stop for here, and you watch the 3